So we've had a bit of a problem recently on Steam, well I suppose not even recently, just for a while, on Steam, with games not necessarily getting the recognition that they deserve. And of course that's bound to happen for all kinds of reasons on a platform with just a gazillion games, and I mean some days you have like a dozen releases just that day. So things can get buried quite quickly, but it's not always easy to pinpoint the exact reason where any particular game might be more or less popular. But in this case, I wanted to use a game that I feel kind of strongly for as a reason to talk about something that I feel is actually worth making a video about. Which is why I'm doing it. So, as you've probably guessed by the title of the video and the footage in the background, this game is Dead Cells, which in my opinion is an excellent game that is currently going through the Early Access program, and Early Access is really where this problem is focused. Now, by recognition, I don't just mean success, like sales numbers and revenue. I also mean straight recognition for what they're doing for their genre, for moving things forward, for being a good basis for innovation for other games to iterate upon, and things like that that come after them. Things like this, the smaller things that aren't always noticed. And these are actually very important, especially for the kind of fledgling genres, the smaller sub-genres and mechanical sets that we're seeing now, things like Rogue-lite and Souls-like and things like that, that are fairly new and getting more and more popular. Because they need this sort of layered iteration where multiple games try it, add and subtract different things. Some other games see that and maybe take some of the things that were successful from other games they've seen and build upon that. You need this sort of ecosystem of multiple games building upon each other to actually create what could be defined more as a genre than a kind of nebulous set of mechanics, as it currently is now. And Dead Cells is in a pretty interesting spot. Basically I decided to sort of make this video after seeing some discussion, kind of mixed discussion online in a couple of different places, on some message boards, some forums, and a couple of other places. And there always seems to be this divide in people talking about the game. Some people just kind of wanting to write it off, and that are a bit not impressed, we'll just say, and others that are significantly more excited about it. And the divide is a pretty hard one, because if you actually look at what they're saying, the divide always seems to be between people that have played it and people that haven't. And this is where the actual issue lies. You see the way the game describes itself on Steam. And it describes itself with phrases like Metroidvania, Rogue-lite, Souls-like, things like that. These are descriptions of genres and mechanical sets. And they're accurate. It's not the game's fault. The way that Motion Twin has described its game is entirely accurate. If you've actually played it, you will see that the way that these different descriptions are actually implemented is actually really nicely balanced, but I'll get more into that when I describe the game later and tell you why you should play it. But more to the point, the other part of this sort of twofold problem is that the people that see that kind of description on early access and then decide not to partake necessarily aren't entirely wrong for doing so. Which is what makes this a problem, in my opinion, worth talking about and worth making a video about. And that's why I wanted to use Dead Cells as the example, because I've seen this in action with this particular game specifically, and it's something that I can pinpoint as being a problem that I actually understand the reasoning behind. And Dead Cells is a good example to use because it just displays such competence in its design. And like I said, I want to get more into that a bit later, but first let's kind of go into the issue as it is. In early access right now, we have kind of we develop a sort of boy who cried wolf problem, where games are often put up that try for the what is currently popular sort of mold. They will go for this is what is trending right now, this is popular, let's make a game that does that. But when they do it, sometimes they don't necessarily, the developers, understand exactly why that thing is popular, what makes people want that thing. And they try and ape the success of other games that have tried to do that thing as well. And oftentimes these games can just be put on the early access system, that way they don't have to be finished at first, and they may never get finished because they don't see the kind of success they need to get finished, and they end up just sort of languishing in the system as an unfinished kind of cash grab, really. It's a bit of a cynical way of looking at it, I know, but it does happen, unfortunately. And then you get a game that actually does do these things well, but because it is in the mold of what is popular right now, people are immediately wary of it, no matter how good it is purported to be. And that's not wrong. That's simply the case of people being, people being responsible consumers. They don't want to waste their money, so you can't really tell people that they're wrong for doing that because it's exactly what they should be doing. But then it comes down to, what do these games need to do to actually prove themselves to be the sorts of games that are being made well versus the sorts of games that are just kind of languishing on the system and were an obvious grab at trying to be whatever the current popular trend is before the next trend happens, to just sort of capitalize on what is popular right now. However, that's kind of what I wanted to talk about. So you see, one of the biggest differences is this. A lot of these games, and not all of them, of course, this is one of the big reasons why I wanted to do the early access series that I do, is to try and pick through the system myself and find things that I personally feel are worthwhile to take a look at. Although I'm only one person and it's certainly not perfect, but I do try. The idea is that some of these games are treating game development more like a formula, like a scientific formula. And by that I mean, as long as you have all of the necessary components, the elements in place, the result should turn out the same every single time. However, as we've seen, that's not actually true. And to use an example, I'd like to use DayZ, because that was one of the big examples of like early access trend setting. DayZ was a hugely successful mod for Arma 2, and then eventually, of course, it got its standalone release and came to Steam as an early access title, and it was massively popular there. And then a lot of games after that decided to try and capitalize on the open world multiplayer zombie survival trend. It actually became kind of a running joke for a while that every time a new sort of game like that was released on Steam Early Access, the joke was, it's open world multiplayer, does it also have zombies and crafting? But the reason a lot of these games weren't as successful, the reason that this sort of thing happened, was because they were basically just treating the development more like a formula. As long as they had an open world, you put some buildings in there, lots of them enterable by players, you maybe put a city somewhere on the map if you're feeling saucy, you sprinkle some weapons and some gear and some supplies in there, you add in multiplayer, of course, and make sure that the players can shoot each other in the teeth, because for some reason that's what you're going to be doing most of the time. You plop in the zombies, you add in a hunger and thirst system and a basic inventory, and away you go. You have all of the elements that DayZ had. So therefore, lightning will strike twice, right? And your game will be super popular. No, actually. That's not what happened to the vast majority of them, and in fact, most of them aren't even actively developed anymore. They're not even heard of anymore, because most of them didn't go anywhere. Only a few really had any degree of success. DayZ, of course, being one of the big ones. And the others that are currently known in this sort of, multiplayer open world survival mold had to break from those conventions and do something different to show that they weren't just following a formula. Games like Ark, Survival Evolved, for instance, that had to, instead of zombies, there are dinosaurs. And it has a bit more of a focus on crafting and things like that. And then you've got Rust, which has a focus on naked people. And building forts, structures, sort of tentative multiplayer cooperation or shooting each other, but supposed cooperation. And these actually getting rid of the zombies altogether in that one. And these different things actually have decided to do what, and it sounds a little cheesy, I know, but really they've treated game development more like a recipe than a formula. And that's how I feel personally that it really is. In a formula, like I said, as long as everything is there, it should turn out roughly the same every time, but as we've seen time and time again, it doesn't happen that way. Whereas in a recipe, you can have the most just lovely, popular, wonderful ingredients in the world right next to you, but you also have to know how to use them. Because a wonderful, delicious meal isn't going to just make itself out of them. You have to understand how to apply them properly. In a recipe, you need all of the ingredients, and you need to also understand when to use each of them, how much of each of them to use, which ones work together well, which ones can maybe mask some of the more undesirable elements of the others, and things like that. Just having what is popular in your game isn't enough to make your game popular. You also have to understand why those things are popular in the first place, what people... things are popular because people like them. And people like them because they find something to like in them. So that means if your game is trying to do those things, you need to actually not just have the thing that people like, but understand why it's liked and do something with it. So that's where we come back to Dead Cells. Because in my opinion, Dead Cells, well, it excels at this because it basically... It's made by a group of people that has done something to move its various genre descriptors and its sort of mechanical sets forward in a lot of ways. It's made by people that clearly know what they're doing, that you could never mistake for not having played way too much of the various games that they claim to have been inspired by, because it's clear they have. So I think the best way to describe this is, for instance, in Dead Cells, you will see things like the design of the different pieces. You have to break down what the game is composed of, like on this Steam page. And this will help you figure out whether a game is just trying to be a pile of buzzwords to capitalize on what is currently popular, or a game that is actually made by people that understand why people like those things, and they probably like those things too, and are actually making it well. So let's try Metroidvania, for instance. That's one of the big descriptors on the Dead Cells page, Metroidvania. Well, what's one of the biggest, most important pieces of a Metroidvania game of any kind? Well, that would be the exploration, the world traveling, the world building, the actual moving around the levels and things like that. The levels themselves have to be recognizable. Every level has its own personality, every area has its own enemy set and its own way of navigating it that's a little bit different from the others. If you've ever played a Metroidvania game of any kind, you know that each place is kind of unique in its own way. You've got your clock towers and your tall chasms and your deep pits and your weird cliff sides and your straight narrow areas, and every sort of piece of the world is a bit different from every other piece. And then you look at some of the other descriptors, like, say, Rogue-lite, and you realize, oh, okay, that could be bad. Rogue-lite and Metroidvania don't seem to go together very well, because one of the big parts of roguelites is that they tend to have a lot of procedural generation in their levels. And in my personal opinion, Metroidvania and procedural generation don't go well together at all. It's hard to have a good level, a good recognizable level design with a lot of personality that is also completely procedurally generated. So, what they've done is recognize this and reined in the procedural generation to where it only affects a little bit. It only affects a little of the areas involved, and most of the actual areas are handmade, like it should be for Metroidvania. Every area is more or less the same feeling every time, but the exact paths may change a little bit for each run. They're using Metroidvania to the advantage that it has in that particular recipe, as I said, and then using it to sort of cover the more weaker part of the design, that being the roguelite aspect of level generation. So that they're using one ingredient to its advantage while also using it to sort of mask another ingredient that would have a disadvantage at that part. And that's good game design. The old sewers are always going to be a cramped, poison water-filled space with lots of vertical climbing and specific enemies laid in specific locations where you have to try and get to them and not get stabbed by the spikes they're generating. The cool fog sort of wharf area after the first boss is always going to be a wood dock, themed area that is quite flat, very long, and has a lot of buildings you can go into. The buildings are separate areas where you can actually enter them, travel up in a narrow internal space, and then end up exiting at the sort of second upper layer on top of the level to travel high up along the rooftops of the sort of wharf area with lots of pirate enemies and other things like that. Every area has its own personality, which is how Metroidvania should be. And then you've also got, let's say, the combat. This is where the Souls-like comes in. They've managed to create Souls-like combat that actually works very well in 2D. In a different way than Soul and Sanctuary did, but with similar design characteristics because it is Souls, after all. There are certain things that kind of need to be done. Because, of course, Metroidvania tend to have fairly simplistic, not necessarily bad, often good, but in variety instead of in like mechanical depth combat systems. So they decided, okay, let's cover up some of the Metroidvania elements and use those to focus on world building, and instead the combat should be focused on the Souls-like ingredients. And so they've made the combat focused on things like timing. Every weapon is pretty much viable, but every weapon and spell has its own delay, its own animation set, and has its own timing that you have to memorize. How long a specific swing takes, or how long a specific spell takes before it casts, and how long enemies' attacks take, and what kind of arcs their attacks actually travel through, and when you need to dodge. Your dodge openings are important, your attack openings, depending on what weapons you're using, are important, things like that. All of the sorts of things that you would think about while playing a game like Dark Souls are transferred over here just fine into a 2D kind of format. And it works really well. And they have deliberately used this system to kind of, look at the jumble, I suppose you could say, of mechanics and then make a clean inspiration out of it, rather than just have it a mess. You could easily see a game saying, we are a Metroidvania, we are a Rogue-lite, we are a Souls-like, and think that it's going to be just a jumbled mess of nonsense. But this is the clear difference when it's made by people that know what they're doing, that clearly love those things, and that have a design goal in mind. You instead end up with something where each individual piece of that puzzle is actually, it comes to prominence in the part where it is needed most, and the other parts fade into the background where they are potentially the least useful. The combat takes the most inspiration from the Souls-like portion, the exploration takes the most inspiration from the Metroidvania portion, and then you have some other elements that really help to move the Rogue-lite sort of mechanical set forward, like using the in-level teleporters from Enter the Gungeon, something that really, in my opinion, moved the sort of sub-genre forward as well. And now you've even gotten something that takes those and moves them forward a bit more. The timed doors along the levels, that if you get to without a certain amount of time passing in that run, you can open and get some sweet-ass loot. You can then use those in-level teleporters to still be able to explore levels and power yourself up to move on without spending too long in each one, so you can move on to the next area and hopefully find one of those timed doors quickly enough to be able to enter them. That's good game design. You're using previous entries into this genre to inspire you, using some of the mechanics that they have innovated to include, and then building on those in your own way, and then using, kind of your game mechanics along with theirs to make something else. So yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to say, I guess. The the game is excellent. Dead Cells is extremely good. Please do go play it if you get the chance. It is an awesome game, and don't just write it off for being a, I guess, trend capitalizing pile of buzzwords, because it's not. It's very well made, it's an extremely competent game, and it's showing a lot of promise. It isn't early access, but it's not expensive, and it already has a tremendous amount of content to it. And that's, I guess, kind of the solution to the problem we currently are facing in early access games. Look for games that clearly are showing competence by the developers, that understand how to balance the different ingredients that they are given. It doesn't matter if those ingredients happen to be the ones that are popular right now. That's not something that should make you shy away from the overall recipe. It's how they're actually applied. Anyway, I hope this video was useful to people. I hope that the point kind of came across in what I was trying to say, and I hope that someone, at least somewhere, got something from this. If, well, actually I do plan on doing a little bit more coverage of Dead Cells probably as it updates, because the next couple of big updates are looking to be very promising indeed. So, yeah. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.